Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the June 23rd meeting of the Council Study Committee on compensation terms and voter engagement. We'll go ahead as we normally do and ask for a motion to approve the June 9th meeting minutes. If there's any, unless there's any questions, comments, revisions to those.
So moved.
Okay, we got a motion to approve the minutes and there's a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, meeting minutes are approved. Quick review. At the June 9th meeting, we agreed to recommend moving the elections to even years. And we began our discussion of voter engagement and council expansion. As most of you probably know now, our effort or our recommendation to move the elections to even years was preempted, I guess, by this General Assembly. They passed Senate Bill 722. The governor hadn't acted on it yet, but it doesn't sound like there's any risk that he won't. And that moved Raleigh elections permanently to even years. It also delayed the election until November of 2022, which most of you probably heard about. And then for other cities and towns in the state in the same situation, that moved their elections to March of 2022. So then I also, I presented our interim report to City Council. It went smoothly. I don't think I've messed anything up too badly. Council seemed receptive to our recommendations. They asked a few questions, mostly related to compensation, and they accepted it and took it under advisement. They didn't indicate that they were, what they planned on doing with it or when, but like I said, I think it went well. I thank you to everybody that reviewed it and gave me comments and assistance with it. So I sent around some notes in addition to the agenda. I sent a couple articles that you may or may not have read, but then I also just trying to kind of give us some different ways to think about this effort. So one of the questions I asked was, what do we think the characteristics of an ideal city council are in a council manager city like Raleigh? Because we're talking about size, we're also talking about voter engagement. And then, to the extent we have an idea about that, then, some of the other questions I had was, does the size of council influence any of the, any of these characteristics? Do four-year terms influence those? Had a staggering, and then compensation. But I don't know, what do you all think about, and we'll get to engagement because I think it circles back to that, but, what do we think about the ideal council? How do they interact with the manager? And I say that because part of the idea about the size does have an impact on the manager's work and the staff's work. So if you have a 8-person council versus a 12-person council, depending on your view of what each council member's role is, that's a significant additional group of folks that might be asking for meetings with the manager, information from the manager, meetings with the manager. So I thought we could start by just kind of talking about, what do we think an ideal city council is? in a council manager form of government. If anybody has any thoughts on that, or, you know, if we don't, then we can move on as well. Don't everyone overwhelm me at once. I mean, do we agree that they should operate more as a board of directors versus hands-on? You know, we talked about this kind of in the beginning of our when we first started meeting. You know, some council members may view their job as getting in the weeds and really meeting with staff. Some may not. But I think the general sense in the way it's supposed to operate in a council manager form of government is the council acts like a board of directors and sets the broad policy, but really shouldn't be involved in the day-to-day activities. Is that generally what you all think about it, or do you, Harvey?
Yeah, short answer is yes. I think it is that should be the relationship, that the council should be looking at the big picture as much as possible, while being obviously constituent responsive. But constituent responsive should be referring it to the manager and his staff or her staff for action, as opposed to being into it themselves to a great degree. But, you know, I looked at the report from 2003, and the amount of activity from all of those counselors seems to be relatively high, regardless of whether it's a council manager or a council mayor form of government. And to some extent, I suspect it's based on their individual sense of how much they should be doing and their sense of duty, or their sense of discipline on how they use their time in their role as in charge of governance. So I had put down collaborative was an ideal element. When I look at that report, it seems the larger you get, the harder it's going to be on the collaborative side, simply because people in leadership or people who are counselors will wind up getting sided off into different areas. When you've got so many of them, some will get more attention than others. But for ideal, I had collaborative and committed and engaged.
Some of the characteristics I wrote down were, you know, an ideal council would generally reflect the demographic makeup of the city. It's no larger than necessary. Having an odd number to avoid deadlocks. More likely to focus on strategic direction of the city and less on the parochial interests of small groups of aggrieved citizens. Understands its role in setting broad policy for the city, gives clear, precise direction to professional staff, and ensures adequate funding for the implementation of established policies. So that's kind of where I was on it, or am on it. Beth, I think you look like you were maybe about to say something.
I was sort of nodding in agreement with you and Harvey. I would say that, you know, in terms of, you know, my understanding of the council manager form of government, that board of directors model is precisely what we're going for. And, you know, I agree with the concept that the board, you know, ought to include people who are, you know, collaborative. Certainly, you know, we have seen more schisms in politics of late. And so, you know, ideally, at least at the local level, we could find an opportunity for collaboration. And I agree that, as small as necessary is appropriate to improve efficiency with a focus on empowering the professional staff that really are the folks that are carrying out the day-to-day operation of the city. So that's sort of my thought process.
Nirvana, you kind of look like you might be ready to say something. No? Okay.
Believe it or not, no.
Well, then let's, the other kind of moving into.
Eric?
Yes.
Yeah, I just had some quick thoughts.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I mostly agree with what's been said. I did want to say though, while I agree that with a manager council setup, that the kind of board of directors analogy makes some level of sense. At the end of the day, for me, council is at its core a representative body. And so where I think it's important that, yes, I want my representatives to be big picture thinkers and to be looking at the well-being of the city as a whole and its trajectory and all of those things. That is a substantive value judgment that I make that I am wary about placing on council as a whole. And I think it is equally important that we also keep in mind that that representative aspect is incredibly important and ties in a lot with the voter engagement aspect that we'll be talking more about later. And so one of the qualities that I was thinking of that's important to me in council is that it recognizes the responsibility for persuasive leadership that it carries. They are not simply there to take, this is the big picture that Raleigh is going in and we're going to vote it and then city staff is going to implement it. If there are holdouts within our community, members of our community that have questions about where that big picture is taking the city, where that big picture, how that big picture is affecting disaffected or underrepresented groups within our community, then I think that it's fair to expect that council has enough diverse representation, ideologically, geographically, demographically, to account for those differences of opinion, to account for those questions within the community, and that council feels not just the democratic obligation, but also the moral importance of then, okay, you need to persuade people to come along with you. It's not just enough to say, we're here for the big picture and the holdouts shouldn't get in the way of that. So I'm a little cautious about some of that value judgment language that seems to be popping into some of our language.
No, and that makes sense. And that was one of my characteristic about reflecting the demographic makeup of the city, because I think most of the other things we're saying kind of assumes that, but we know that you can't assume that because it's not true, it's not accurate. So that.
Yeah, and I think that when we're thinking about there might be some tension between like having the values that you just articulated and I went over and the smallest possible value, right? It would be great if we had a perfectly representative small body of people. That historically has not been how that's played out on our council. So it might be that in order to arrive at the values of better representation, leading to more engagement, a more thorough discussion of the pros and cons of change and growth and all of those things might mean that we have to balance out that lever with size. So that's what I wanted to put on the table as we keep talking about this.
Definitely, thank you. So then, that's kind of the ideal council. The other question I had, or I put a couple of other questions to kind of help guide our discussion today. And again, feel free to interject any way you want. What do we think the characteristics of the ideal voter? So these are the questions I said. So what are the characteristics of the ideal voter in Raleigh city council elections? And then what are the barriers keeping residents from becoming ideal voters in Raleigh? What specific action, this gets towards the engagement, what specific action should Raleigh take to minimize or eliminate these barriers? And then what's the city's legal authority regarding these items? So, what would we like to see in our voters in a perfect world. Because I think we can talk about that and then kind of back into the engagement and the, some of those issues.
Eric, this is Beth. On that, obviously I think we want voters that vote.
I think Diana had her hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Diana.
Yes.
Did you have your hand raised or want to add to the?
Yeah, yes, I did. I want to speak slowly on because it is very important because
You just broke up. I don't know if you can hear us.
yeah, I can hear you all. Can you all hear me?
I can now. You broke up for a minute.
Okay. I wanted to speak slowly on this because I'm one that believes in making sure that we got clear understanding, that a community is educated on can you hear me now? Can you still hear me?
Yep, we can hear you
Okay.
good.
Okay. That the community is educated on whatever direction that we go in. If it's to educate the community on that. Because people feel that if I elect this individual to represent me, I've come out and I voted, then I expect them not just
You're breaking up.
pass everything over to the staff.
Hey,
Did that make
Diana,
sense?
hey, Diana, you were clear and then you started breaking up again, right when you made your key moment, your key point, I think. You missed it.
Oh my goodness. I'm on travel, so that's why I'm moving around.
The part I heard was that I think the community needs to be educated about the direction of the city or the direction council's going in, and then you started to break up.
But that's it. That's the key. And I'm gonna leave it at that.
So
I'll leave it right there.
So I'm going to try to make sure I understand the point, and if I get it wrong, correct me. But I think your point is people vote. Whoever gets elected starts running the city, and there needs to be good communication back to voters so that they kind of know what direction the city's going in and understand it, so they can decide whether they agree with it or not. And if they don't agree, then they obviously can do something about it at the next election. Is that in the neighborhood of?
It sounds about right.
That is correct.
I think you said
You
the
got
longest. I think you said the longest correct I've ever heard. You were breaking up, but I think you said that's correct. How about others? I'm Beth. I appreciate we want people to vote. In my perfect.
Got it right.
In my perfect world, I also want them to be knowledgeable about, the issues and engaged. And so, for me, the perfect voter is someone that, does have knowledge of the issues, is engaged, more often than not, and understands the issues. How about others?
Hi, Eric. One thing I would say is probably more or greater transparency in government. I think when we look at our population and our residents, I think they need to be able to invest and trust in their elected officials. And historically, you have a lot of candidates, politicians who run, and they simply just don't deliver on their platforms or what they say they're going to do. And I think that creates just a level of distrust amongst voters and individuals, and really makes them skeptical about what their government at the local level, whatever level, state level, can actually do to address their needs and concerns. So I think transparency in government, in all functions, facets of government, and just building up that rapport, that level of trust amongst the public.
How about, well, in some degrees, it's interesting because in some respects, we have more transparency than we ever had, just in terms of access to meetings, access to meeting minutes. Now, there are exceptions, obviously, on any given matter. But it's interesting that, I can remember when I started, working out after law school, and, minutes weren't readily available. We didn't have GIS maps, zoning, things were all down at the city. So it's kind of interesting. And so now to some extent, there's a lot more information available to voters. But, trying to engage voters and get them to, in some respects, reach out and use that information. But I understand too, there's an obligation on the elected officials part and the city in general to make sure there's as little friction, between the citizens and their access to information and decision making. Harvey, you look like you want to say something.
So this probably refers to both council and voter. They should seek to be informed, and there should be some element of humility. I don't know how we get to that. In the absence of anything's possible if you don't know what you're talking about. And you have a lot of voters who are in that space, and sometimes they need to take the time to inform themselves about what the real options are that council has to face. And I think that's an ideal, but I don't know how you get to that sort of situation given current behavior. But there is an absence of trying to understand the variety of competing values that are at play on pretty much every decision that council makes, and how that affects a cohesive vision, which then probably goes back to councilors need to be good communicators in some form or fashion back to their constituents about the challenges that they face. But then voters, on the other hand, have to recognize that there's a dichotomy here, and they can't have everything they want.
Well, one thing that it's been interesting. I'm on a group that's working on one of the small area plans for the city, and I've been involved as a citizen on some as well. And this one I'm on in my role as a part of the Raleigh Housing Authority. But staff make huge efforts to involve citizens in these decisions. They've been hanging flyers on doors and emails and posting, and despite all those efforts, there's still often very little community engage, community participation in these decisions the city makes. And I'm always struck by that. And this goes to that as well. And I'm curious about other people, how do we work through those barriers? People are, they work full time, they have, children, they have jobs, they have, struggles. And quite often the people that the city needs to hear from the most are the people that also have the most challenges in terms of participating. They're working, they don't have jobs necessarily that they can take off from whenever they want, or they don't have childcare to go downtown to a meeting in the evening. And I'm just curious for how other people, what people think about that, or how do we penetrate that to get those folks involved or to hear from them?
So Eric, I actually think that for me is a much more thought-provoking and helpful way of framing our responsibilities here today and what we can potentially bring to council and to our community through this study group. So the discussion around what is the ideal voter like starts sounding to me kind of like the law school tort example of like the reasonable man in the sky, where it's like, yes, if we all imagine this dispassionate, totally rational, totally average human and how they would react, and we use it as a model. The problem that we always run into, of course, is like that person doesn't exist, right? And we have to meet people where they are. Like you said, people have jobs or multiple jobs, or dealing with childcare problems and working through Zoom, or observing their children working through Zoom over this last year. And they're dealing with a lot of things that we know, no one person, no one ideal is ever going to encapsulate. So to me, asking the question of, so how can we and how can the city best serve people where they're at, to me starts bringing up more of, okay, so that requires a lot of city directed, or from the city to the people, information around here's when the elections are, here's where voting sites are, even though the city doesn't really have control over voting locations, right? That's done on a county level, is my understanding, even for the municipal elections. A lot of humans of Raleigh, we are going to give you as much information as we can. I'm going to hark back to my idea of a voter guide that goes out to all households, simply telling everybody, here's what's on your ballot, and including an application for an absentee ballot if that's what they want. And then know that, yeah, sometimes people are going to vote because they have an emotional reaction to something that's going on, or they don't like something that's happening within a 3-block radius, but that's the corner of Raleigh that they care most about. And that's what's going to lead their decision making. And I'd rather us be as curious as we can about all of the people in Raleigh, because I think that's what this group is here to do. And hope that, yes, that those attributes will be broadly shared amongst the community. But I think starting from what can we do, as opposed to would we like to turn the people of Raleigh into, might get us to some more concrete ideas.
So what we've got, so let's talk about some of those. And that's where I kind of wanted to end up, was what are steps that we think the city potentially should take, and then what can they take? So we may think they should do a lot of things, and they may not be able to do some of them for legal reasons, or any other number of reasons. I think we've heard voter guide a few times.
And in North Carolina, are we allowed to implement any kind of automatic voter registration?
My understanding is that would have to come from the state, but I'm sure Brandon or Janie could answer that.
I didn't hear that question.
I was just thinking about, kind of what we know about automatic voter registration, and wondering if the state allows a city, or just in general, automatic voter registration to be an option, even if it's at a municipal level.
Janie, I don't know if you've looked at that. That would really be more of we could ask the Wake County Board of Elections, but it's going to be state and county law that
right.
I don't think we can interfere with that.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that yet, but I would agree with Catherine's comment. That's something that would have to probably come from the state, or we would have to talk to the county about it.
What are other barriers? I said
So-
barriers to becoming an ideal voter, but barriers to participating in the process that
So let me speak to Catherine's point, which I think is a good one. How do we get to the voters where they are? And I was always a believer in over communicating as a way in which to make certain that everybody stays in some sort of, common direction. And that becomes, I would imagine, a management style for both council and the manager, and the amount of resources that they're willing to budget to do that kind of communication. So to meet people where they are, you've got to send out some representative of the city to, I think in many instances, speak to them personally, because they're not going to be prone to reading a report or even the directory or the whatever review, ballot review. I frankly don't know how much they're going to spend doing that. I know I get the judge's deal, and if I've got time, I might, but it's not something I'm going to pore over. So I don't know. There may be other outreach ideas that municipalities have tried to try and reach voters where they are. And I don't know what those strategies are. Catherine did a couple of links the last time, and I apologize for not having pored over those as diligently as I did the other two today. But anyway, that's my ramble at the moment. More coming.
I do think there's some really good ideas in some of the links that Catherine shared. So thank you for pulling those for us, Catherine, and sharing them. For me, it starts with voters need to know there's an election. And that's kind of, as someone who's kind of been through the process too, it's astonishing how many people don't know when we vote, how frequently, and those kinds of things, or even who represents them. And so that has to be the starting point before you start, to me, before you start informing people on issues or trying to give them background and context and further engage them.
I am pulling up that the report that Catherine sent, because it did have some interesting things. Some of what it had wouldn't be allowed under North Carolina law, but for cities. But I thought, there were things like, transportation to polls. Can the city? I know that I think they've made, I know the buses are fare free right now, but I think the city made them fare free on election day when they weren't free in the past. So we know they can do that. And Ashton, you were checking out, is that correct? Is my memory right? Okay.
Yeah, they made them fare free ongoing.
Could the city finance a more aggressive process for getting people to the polls on election day? Is that something we think is worthwhile? I think to Harvey's point about whether people will look at something or not, my view is they may or may not, but I don't think we should assume that they won't use the information if it's there. Even if we, my view is, even if we, let's say a normal election is going to have 10% turnout, if spending a certain amount of money and putting voter guides in hands, and if that bumps turnout by several percentage points, and we increase the knowledge of some voters to, I think it's a worthwhile expense. The city spends a lot of money on a lot of things. My experience has been that citizens are they lack knowledge about what's going on in the city, and that's across education and socioeconomic spectrum. I mean, I've talked to, some of the most educated, wealthy people about what's going on in the city, and most, quite often, they have no idea what's going on. And the same is true for folks that are, kind of on the opposite spectrum. I don't know what the reasons are, but a lot of people just are not engaged in local government, and it doesn't seem to be tied to a particular group of people. I think it's across the board. It may be higher percent among certain groups, but generally speaking, my experience has been people don't know a lot about what's going on in this community. Beth?
Yeah, I think in terms of voter turnout, in knowing when the election is, we've taken a huge step forward in having the election in even years in November when people expect an election, which was to me always a challenge with the municipal elections here in Raleigh. They were odd years in October, and nobody expects to vote in October. That was certainly a shock to me when I arrived here. But I like the idea of a voter guide if that's something that we can do. And I wonder also if, because as Harvey said, folks may discard it or not pay any attention to it when it comes in the mail. But I wondered if at the city locations where voting takes place, if we might also just have a pile of those available for folks, who are coming in to vote. They might have a more sudden interest in it as they're going through, realizing that city council's on the ballot there. And it seems like so many of the voting places are sort of, parks or schools or fire stations or things like that, where the city would have, the opportunity at least to put those voter guides out.
I agree. And then in addition to that, one of my questions was, assuming the city can fund and produce the voter guide, then could it also post it on the city's website? Could they have a voter resource page? And I know it's got to be objective and those types of things. And then the other question that I had running through my head was, that various groups sponsor candidate forums during, the election time. Could the city actually host those or facilitate those if it was something people felt was useful? Can the city help with the public access channel, to use that as also a way to do voter education somehow? So those may be some questions for the city attorney's office.
Janie can address this.
Hey, Janie.
Yeah. Hi. So we definitely think that we can put the voter guide out there. The only real prohibition that we know of is that we can't use public funds to endorse candidates. So as long as everything is neutral and as long as we're giving access to all the candidates, we don't have an issue. Now, if we want to put restrictions on access that have to do with, say, support, like candidate support or things like that, then we get into First Amendment forum analysis issues. And so we'd have to evaluate that at the time, depending on what restrictions they wanted to have in place. But other than the general rule that we can't spend public funds to endorse candidates, we're not aware of anything that would prevent us from holding, like you were saying, the forums, putting it on the public access channel, doing the brochures, all of that seems fine, provided it doesn't end up leaning one way or another.
So then let me ask you this question, because I can foresee it happening. We get a candidate that city decides, hey, we're going to do a voter guide. I think that's great. We get a candidate that decides they are running, and they worship Satan. I don't know, just, and they put some, candidate statement out there that's got some inappropriate language and things like that. How does that play into it? And maybe I'm overthinking it, but I just know how stuff happens, and somebody may just, I assume you gotta let that go.
I think there are limits on what we have to let go, obscenity type of allowances that we could prevent. But I think we would just evaluate it at the time when it came up. Because I think there's a lot of different situations that could come up, but we would have to just wait till the time.
But in general, it sounds like Catherine and then Beth.
Yeah, so Eric, I'm looking at the statute that the State Board of Elections used for the judicial voter guide. So it has language in there that addresses what the candidates could and couldn't submit. So everything from your statement may include information such as your qualifications, endorsements, ratings, why you're seeking office, why you'd make a good judge, what distinguishes you from your opponents, those kinds of things. And then says the State Board of Elections will reject any portion of the statement which it determines contains obscene, profane, or defamatory language. So that category exists outside of those First Amendment concerns and would let the city avoid, somebody who just decides to use a bunch of F-bombs to explain why they're great and their opponents suck.
Gotcha. Okay. So I think that sounds like one recommendation we can get behind I'm not asking for, an agreement today, but that sounds like one that everybody can get behind.
It's definitely a great go by, great guidance.
Are there other concrete, so voter guide, and then
I think, well, I'm just thinking about Catherine's idea as well that she mentioned about incorporating a way to request absentee ballots and things like that. And so depending on the timing of when that guide went out, I'm wondering if it's not prudent to think about a postcard mailer or something ahead of time that's like election coming up. Here's, where you find your polling place. Here's where you check your registration status, that kind of thing. If there's not a two-part of that, so that people have the adequate amount of time to get themselves registered, or if we're able to do one-stop voting as well.
So voter guide, and then either with that, probably earlier, potential mailings related to other aspects of the election.
One other point, what about, I guess in recent years, have they extended early voting dates? I know that's probably a State Board of Election issue or concern, but I want to say recently they've extended those dates in which citizens could vote early, or may have permitted polling places to open, certain hours of the day, or extended the days in which they can access polls.
Yeah, and I think that was more on the pandemic case kind of situation, but whatever they ended up doing, I think to the extent the city, can publicize it. One thing that I found is a lot of folks don't distinguish between governments. They don't know what the role of the city is versus the county versus the state sometimes, and who does what. And so maybe just having the city, and I don't think they have it, creating a section on the website about voter resources that, kind of is always there, but also, could be utilized, for, a voter guide and things like that. But But, a lot of people, they say, hey, I'm a voter in the city. I'm going to go to the city's website, to learn about the election. And I don't think there's a lot on the city's website about elections and things like that. There may be a link that sends you to the county and the state board of elections, but maybe we could talk about, the city just adding another kind of a voting resource page to their website as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Eric. And the idea that it includes kind of what the role of a council member is, again, thinking about how we are informing people. And then, this voter guide, if it lives online, and this resource page, if it lives online, can we kind of go back to what I mentioned before? Can we utilize the city's text messaging systems and email systems for outreach to also share digital versions of those in case we're not hitting people on a mailer?
I don't know what all they're using that text for right now. Brendan, you may know better than me. I know it's some to talk about, there's trash announcements about, and, services interruptions and things that might be happening downtown. Do you know if there's anything else?
Yeah, there are a lot of operating restrictions on the texting programs because we're actually running it through Wake County. And so it really has to be limited to sort of core delivery of services or emergency communications. I know more broader communications have occurred through the city's Gov delivery channel, which has been primarily through emails. But I think the city would have some restrictions in terms of content if it's wading into anything in the elections arena.
Well, I guess
Yeah,
one
that
thing.
makes some sense, I think. I was just gonna say, if I can get 3 text messages and 2 phone calls about yard waste pickup, it seems like I should be able to get a text message about an upcoming election notification.
I would agree. We ought to sort of check that out.
Well, the other thing that might be possible, the city has that website, the sign up for the, I don't know what it's called, but for emails, and you pick what topics you're interested in. So I guess one thing could be you could opt in to be notified about things related to the election. Not sure how many people do that, but the other thing is maybe when people are signing up, there could be a note that's, that as the election approaches, anybody that signed up for any notification across the email spectrum, could get notified of, the objective information, the voter guide, when the election is, that kind of stuff. Regardless of which topic, if they only signed up to be notified of the agenda for the appearance commission, once every few years they're going to get, or every 2 years, they're going to get an occasional email about the election as well. And if that's something that's allowed, I don't know why that wouldn't be, or as well.
Eric, we can certainly reach out and talk to the county because they're the ones who administer the contract we do it through. And since the Board of Elections is county supported and it is a county function, it might be something that they would view as equivalent to a public service they're providing. So we can check on that.
And that's related to the texting system, not the email. The city
Correct.
controls that email. I forgot what y'all call it. The city controls the email sign up.
So,
Right, it's
so
Gov
gi-
delivery.
and so given that the county and the city are going to be on the same cycle, the county might be willing to do it broadly to everybody in the county regarding dates potentially, without violating some sort of precedent situation where they're doing something for one community and not for another. I don't know, but I think it's worth a look.
Is it the county government, Wake County government that operates that texting system, or is it a third party vendor?
Yeah, and I think to Eric's point, so I know the city is currently doing a pilot working with DRA for texting notifications within the downtown area. I think that's separate from the emergency notifications that are run through a contract that we have with the county that run through emergency communications. And so we can talk to the IT staff that support those 2 platforms and sort of figure out what operating parameters exist between the 2.
Right. I wouldn't be surprised if you could, I don't know if there'd be some intra-government aid or intra-government agreement which would permit such access.
So
Another thing we could potentially recommend is that all these features that we're talking about, they could exist in a kind of unified website that, yeah, is part of the city website, but belongs to that new community engagement office that the city just allocated budget money for. I think, so like I just Googled Raleigh election and literally nothing on the first page of results had anything to do with the city of Raleigh or its website. So I think that kind of shows us that like, even if a citizen tried to find this out, they would not be finding the Raleigh city website. And so I think we can probably recommend that that office have a landing page that covers this information, that covers that educational piece that Ashton and others were talking about here's your city council, here's what they do, here's what like Raleigh municipal government is responsible for, as opposed to like Wake in the city or in the state and everything. And probably just have some really basic SEO incorporated into that website.
yeah, so I think this is like so many other issues. There's no magic bullet that's gonna, drive a bunch of people to become informed. And the biggest thing that probably is gonna drive people to go vote is what's already happened, which is moving the elections to even number of years. I think if we do this handful of things we've talked about, a voter guide, figuring out ways to distribute that in as many different channels as possible, potentially additional mailings to let people know the election's coming and how to either register or ask for absentee ballot. That kind of combined, kind of comprehensive effort, those things are more likely to have any kind of beneficial effect than anything else we could do. And, yeah, they may take some money, but after the initial setup, it kind of runs on, kind of goes into autopilot, except for the effort to put together the voter guide. Are there other concrete steps that we would like to see? Are there other ways we could make it easier for people to get to the polls that have?
One thing just before we jump to that, Eric, I did want to clear up. I was able to confirm that automatic voter registration is not legal in North Carolina. But we do, and I think it happened during the pandemic, we do now allow online registration, entirely online, for DMV customers, which apparently covers about 95% of North Carolinians. So, and just thinking about how maybe that's another avenue that we can get to people.
And that's a good, again, a link that could be on this voter resource page for the city too, because people engage in different ways. Some people know the county more and they might go to the Wake County website more often. Some people deal with the city more often, and so they look to the city's website. There might even be a way to encourage the county to have, to the extent they don't have similar information, or a link to the city's page, assuming we're successful and somebody decides to adopt some of the recommendations we're making.
It would also be really handy to have an interactive map on that site where you could use your address to actually find what district you're a part of. I know that I had a beast of a time when I first moved here trying to figure out where the maps were for who my district representative was. And that could include, during non-election times, a link to that counselor's website if they're maintaining one, or at least to the contact and information for their office. And then during election times, just a list of the people who have filed for that particular seat. And again, that would get incorporated, I imagine, into part of the job responsibilities of those two engagement individuals. But I think that would also be really useful for people to be able to use, to find the reps.
Yeah, and exactly to your point, at the very bottom of the city council page is that like type in your address, find out your counselor thing, but it is at the very, very bottom. So we at least have the technology already ready to do it. So can we on an election-based page, move that to the top and simplify that piece a little bit.
And on the IMAPs, Raleigh IMAPs, when you put your information in, you also can, it does have your election information. It's not easily accessible, but we also have that already in a digitized and an accessible way. So, you know, there is a way to probably make all of that more accessible and user friendly than how it is today for someone that's hunting down information about the election. So I guess to
I am worried
summarize,
that most IMAPS users are on the more informed, more engaged side of things, though.
yes, yeah. So I think a couple of recommendations that it sounds like we're kind of coalescing around. One, an election resource page somewhere housed by the city, maybe maintained by the Office of Community Engagement. And I think Ashton is working with Lou Bonapane to talk about potentially who the right people at the city are to maybe come talk to us kind of about, you know, how they communicate and some of the logistics. And we might be able to ask some of these questions in advance or share this with them and say, these are some of the things we're thinking about. But voter resource page, voter guide, email, possibly text communications related to the election, additional mailings in advance of an election to let people know when the election is, and absentee ballots, maybe registration resources, links to the DMV page about, or information about voter registration. Any other things I've missed specific? Because I want to get a list of actual actionable items we've talked about. The one thing I think we ought to consider exploring is what else the city can do, or what have other cities done in terms of getting people to the polls, helping them get to the polls. You know, could the city, you know, I don't know what they might do. I don't know what they might want to do. Maybe if anybody has the time, maybe we could do a little research on, you know, what if other communities have done anything to help transport, you know, transportation wise to get people to the polls. Other thoughts on that? And we're not going to forego this because again, we're going to get with the folks in the city that would potentially be responsible for some of this, so they can also give us some kind of feedback in terms of logistics, you know, practical realities, you know, of, hey, that sounds like a great idea, but here's why it's difficult, or, you know, what we would need in order to make it happen. But are there other things we think we might want to explore, think about, ask about? Harvey?
So I do think we need a report from the city on what already is being done. Sometimes once you get a sense of the direction things are going, there may be some additional thoughts that we might have off of that. But I'd like to know what kind of outreach, or whether it's intentional at all. They may not have an intentional process, and this new community engagement people are going to establish that strategy. But I'd be interested in knowing what, if anything, they're doing now.
Regarding the election, or, you know.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah,
Correct.
that's a good point. Other information, Beth, go ahead.
Just curious, do city employees get leave to vote? I know some businesses give you a half day or a couple of hours to vote.
I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Brandon?
Yeah, city employees are generally, they have petty leave, which can be taken for anything for like doctor's appointments, kids' doctor's appointments, or for something, a personal obligation such as voting. That can be taken in 2-hour increments. I think it's up to 12 hours per year, but there's not specific time for voting.
Okay, that makes sense though.
I think state
My memory
employees.
may be off, but I do think that the city granted people time to volunteer at the polls last year. I'll do some quick Googling and see if I can find that out, but I feel like something happened during the last election around.
It was COVID, and I think that there were, and Brandon, you can jump in here too, but they have a lot of normally retired and older folks who volunteer at the polls, and because of COVID, I think there was a concern that a lot of those people wouldn't be available, and so that they were trying to find others who would be willing to fill in, and that we agreed to help. I think maybe some county or state board asked us for that, and that's how that came about, if I'm not incorrect.
So if this new community engagement group, as one of their strategies, it could be to try and create some sort of public-private partnership discussion about having the private sector also create opportunities for people to vote, either by generating communications within those organizations themselves, or as the city does, or some may do, is allow them time to go and vote. And that could be done on a voluntary basis, but if it became sort of a community culture thing, it might gain some traction.
I like that.
Great idea.
And there might have
Eric,
been,
to your previous, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say to your previous points around getting people to the polls, I would hesitate to reinvent things that may already exist. I know, for example, Citric Cycle allows free rides that day. Lyft and Uber, I think, also do free rides. So maybe it's more promoting those opportunities or utilizing, it sounds like bus fare is going to stay free. And then thinking about, I know the United Way teamed up with some other entities around vaccinations to help get people to vaccine sites as well. So, is there potentially in the future a nonprofit component of this that's helping to cover some of these costs? So just some other ideas that maybe either can be pulled together by the person who's kind of organizing this website, this community engagement person, or amplified beyond that.
Yeah, and I was going to say, in terms of the engaging with the private sector, that if the city chose to do the voter guide and things like that, we could also work with those groups to private sector to distribute, the guide, in places of business as well. And, the more places you can, if people see something 2 or 3 times, they might actually go, damn, I'm going to actually look at this thing because I've seen it floating around. So there might be some duplication of effort, but I think the more we can get people, the more touch points, the more opportunity you have to get somebody that wouldn't have normally read something or looked at something that we might be successful.
Is there signage on the buses, for example, that we can utilize, internal or external? I know those are sometimes used by different entities to spread information, so that could be an outreach opportunity as well.
Yeah, and so we've gotten a bunch of ideas. That's where usually this stuff happens, and I think one of the recommendations we might want to consider is not just, hey, here are some steps, but also we think this is so important that the city should make this effort part of that community engagement department, someone should actually be tasked with this effort, because I found that, if it's not assigned to somebody or a department, where it's an actual responsibility, it's likely to go by the wayside. And so, again, subject to the group and what you all think, but I think if we think it's important and we think the city should expend money on it, then we probably should also make a recommendation about how to implement it, and that, it actually be officially housed somewhere and, be an official effort. Maybe that's obvious, but.
Question, have the job descriptions for, like the specific call for applications and job description for those new community engagement positions been posted? I didn't notice if that was part of the budget discussion, or if it's just here's going to be an office, there's going to be 2 people. Because it might be helpful for us to know as we're making this recommendation and halfway writing those description ourselves in terms of what we think those people should and shouldn't be doing. It might be worth it to check to see if the city has already decided what their jobs are.
I think it's pretty well underway. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not to say they couldn't take it on after they hire the people, but
Okay.
Is that a full-time job, or are they mainly just coming on as independent contractors or consultants?
no, it's within the city. It's like a new department. Are there 4 people, Brandon?
I think that sounds right, but it would be a new office based within the city manager's office.
With a director and, 3 other people, I think, but I don't know that it would need to be in the job description. I mean, I think part of the whole thing is how to engage the public and get information and get feedback from them and that type of thing. So
if we're going to get a report on current community engagement processes, we might as well get a report on what this new community engagement group is going to do when we next get together.
Yeah, that's one thing I forgot. Robin, can you get us that final report from Mickey Fern, that he did?
yes, I thought somebody did that.
If they did, I missed it. I don't think I
Okay.
remember seeing it.
Okay.
And then Ashton, I think if you don't mind, when you're talking to Lou, can you ask that question about, what has the city, have they done anything official with, in terms of elections? And then whoever, I think we're shooting to have folks come to our next meeting. I'm not sure how that, I'm not sure what the status of the community engagement department is, but maybe we can just kind of get an update on where that stands. And
so if I might, as I'm thinking about this, if we're operating on even numbered years, getting people tuned into the fact that there's an election coming shouldn't be a problem, because there are going to be so much noise out there that people are going to be tired of it. The other thing would be, then it's just a matter of getting them the information about the candidates and making it easier for them to get to the polls, which would be that public-private conversation about giving people time to go and vote. And then what the transportation activity is. So I mean, we ought to take advantage of the momentum that a November ballot affords us and focus our energies on helping that work as effectively as possible, rather than spending a lot of time trying to get people to know that there's a vote coming up.
One thing just to note in kind of the context of all of us thinking about transportation to the polls, I volunteer a couple of times to do that, to take people to the polls. And often what we saw that happen is people ended up at the wrong polling places. They weren't completely registered, those kinds of things. So those are other hurdles that we should probably be aware of in terms of how we think about getting people to vote, and whether this, again, one-stop voting, can we focus more on transportation to the polls during early voting when people have the opportunity to, correct any mistakes in their registration rather than on election day itself?
And in terms of that, I guess that partnership or that potentially contracting with, these private vendors, even like Lyft or Uber, I wonder if the city could push out or could probably invest in advertising, pushing out through the Uber or Lyft app, in order to advertise it, transportation during the election cycle, election season.
I mean, that could be part of included in the voter guide, and on this potential website. But it, if the city was going to do a voter guide, I think there could be kind of a resource page with that, in addition to the candidate information. And again, the more, and if the city accepts the idea, if we make the recommendation, that the email channels, again, if we're going to communicate to voters in some way, there's certain information that you almost think you should attach almost to every communication, and if it was related to the election, and maybe that we could work on that as well. So if there's an email going out, it will also include, information about how to vote, how to get to the polls, and, any number of other pieces of information that would be helpful. Okay, well, let's, I want to move on a little bit again to talk about the council size. We don't have to decide anything today, and we won't. I just want to talk about it for a few minutes before we wrap up, because we're still going to work on engagement. We've got some more stuff to do, and we're going to get more information from the city. But I want to kind of continue the discussion about the size and the makeup. I sent out a little information about the information we looked at, the national peer cities we looked at. For council manager, the average size was 10.3 council members. For North Carolina, the peer cities was 7.9. If you include Raleigh, it was 8.8. If you exclude Raleigh. That report, that research, the not the long report, but the other one that was done for, I forgot which city, their conclusion was the size is all over the board. There was no kind of clear pattern for cities across the country. And so, we're at 8, we can go as high as 12. There's, some view that at large doesn't allow for the diversity that, we would like to have. Harvey?
Why don't we agree on odd versus even for openers, and then we can figure out what we want to do if we want to get larger. I mean, I think there's a real value in having an odd number. So using the options we've got available, that would be either 9 or 11. So I think if we get the odd or even question taken care of, then it starts to narrow within the scope of what the state allows us to do to figure out where we're going.
I mean, that's fine with me. Intuitively, I think that having odd numbers make sense. It hasn't traditionally been a problem, but one council, it might not have been the last one, but it was the one before that. There were deadlocks, and it did cause some issues. So I'm fine with agreeing, to at least say, from a consensus standpoint, that whatever we agree to, we ought to have an odd number of on council. How do others feel about that?
I'm generally in favor of an odd number as well.
Anyone?
I don't think I have especially strong feelings either way. I think my first instinct was an odd number, but I believe it came up in our last conversation as well. I mean, there is something to be said about the need for consensus building when you do have an even number. And given that we really haven't seen that many instances of tie votes over time, at least not that this group could collectively recall, I don't know if it's something that we need to change if it's not broken. But again, I don't feel especially strong on either side. I just thought it was an interesting perspective.
Well, let's talk about it in another way. What are the benefits? We can go to 12. That's the max. There's no question about that. What do we see as the benefits of adding seats?
I think there are different pros and cons depending on which kind of seats you're talking about. I think the pros for adding additional district seats would be the ability for council members who represent individual districts to have a smaller footprint of both people and space that they're responsible for representing and knowing and interacting with. And to the extent we've all talked about the problem with people in Raleigh not knowing what's going on in council or who their representatives are, theoretically, we could make that easier for the council themselves to address by giving them smaller districts. That would require adding more seats. Adding more at-large seats instead. I have a hard time talking about why I think that might be what the pros of that would be, partially because I think it's more value judgment based, right? We've all kind of talked about how we think at-large council members look at the big picture of Raleigh more often. I think whether or not that's a good thing, or at least an unmitigated good, is very much a matter of perspective. So I don't necessarily drop that right in the con space, but it is, I think, a factor that might change. And then, of course, if we added more district seats, because we have recommended the staggered election cycles for districts versus citywide members of the council, then we would have a more lopsided election cycle with more district members as opposed to at-large members. I don't think that's a good or bad. It's just one of the features of how our recommendations are going to work in tandem.
And that's less of a concern now that they've moved to even year. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still going to be lopsided, but it won't be where turnout was kind of a concern of mine if we had just districts on one side and that we stayed in odd years. We might have had an extremely low turnout election, and but that obviously now won't be an issue. The district issue for me, it adds the opportunity for more diversity. I'm not as persuaded by the size issue in terms of population, because we're growing so fast that, yes, today, if you wave the magic wand, adding a couple of districts is going to reduce the number of people that a councilor represents. It's only going to make a marginal difference in the reduction anyway. And then in 4 to 5 years, it's going to be back to what it was before that. It does raise the possibility of, or it would make the physical size of districts smaller. And so that could reduce some of the burden of traveling and getting to constituents. One thing, I don't know, that this may be a city attorney question. You know, I know that if we didn't change anything, the only thing the city has to do is kind of balance the districts. And I guess marginally they change kind of historically they would just kind of change roughly the outer edges of the district to capture or release population to get within that 5%. If we chose to recommend adding a district or two or whatever, I guess then the opportunity becomes, creates the opportunity that the districts could really be reworked to kind of be more compact and more, I don't know the right term, more cohesive, or so that the district kind of has, is made up of a geographic area that has more common, you know, interests versus now, I think, you know, District E, for example, it's District E, right? David Knight, I never get the letters right. You know, that goes to me and inside the Beltline all the way to Briar Creek. You know, I guess some people would think, hey, that's good because there's a diversity of people in there, but others might say, you know, the interests of people in Briar Creek are different than the people that live at North Hills. I don't know the answer to that. But, you know, adding districts, there's more of an opportunity to kind of rework substantively the physical characteristics of each district. I assume that's the case.
It would be up to the council how they want to split it up. You know, I mean, the GIS folks can say, here's one way, here's another way, you know, but it'll be up to the council to how they want to move things around. And if that's how they chose to do it, then that's how they would do it. I mean, in the past, there were, you know, everybody had a piece inside the Beltline. Now, does that make any sense now? Who knows? But, you know, that's how those ended up going way out like that, is because, you know, there were priorities in past years or years from long ago that may not exist anymore. So it would be just, if you added a district, it would be, you know, we'd have to adopt them, or the council would have to adopt them, and the GIS and our office would have to work together to give them options so that, you know, whatever they think that an extra district would provide would, you know, how you move things around. Like you can move one district, you know, so right now around where you and I live, and there is parts of D, E, and A. I mean, I'm in A and I'm, you know, 5 blocks from you, and there are District D that hits Hayes Barton. So should that all be in one? Maybe, you know, so to answer your question, that's a way, but that's again going to be a council call about how they would want to, you know, basically recombine and subdivide, right?
Right. But I think the likelihood of that is more if we added a district than if we didn't. And, you know, I think it's unlikely they would totally revisit the district makeup without having to deal with a new district. But that's an assumption on my part. Other thoughts about, you know, one option is you add a district and you go to 9. I mean, and you'd have 2 at-large, the mayor, and 6 district representatives.
One other thing I'll just point out, with SB 722, which is on the governor's desk still, it has not been signed. If it's not signed, it would go into law on the end of the day, Saturday. But it does provide that all districts are drawn by March 31st. So even though the election is in November, it still really giving us the same amount of time that we would normally have between a regular year census and filing dates, or district drawing dates, not filing dates. So to the extent that matters in the equation, because adding a district is a lot bigger deal than adding in a large seat.
And so that also kind of leads in, I guess, gives us some incentive to try to wrap up our work overall to the extent we can, to let council do what, you know, they need to do procedurally and legally. Other thoughts? I mean, we're going to have to somehow, and again, we don't have to decide today, but we're going to have to kind of come to terms on something, or report out that we didn't reach consensus. And I hope we don't have to do that. And we also,
First thing, Eric, Jenny, what's the lead time on? There are two things that if you wanted to add a district and have it applied to November, then there's two things that would have to be done. The council would have to go through the process of changing the charter and adding that. And then they would also have to go through the exercise of mapping it. So if you go backwards from March 31st, because you'd have to have it in place before March 31st, right, Janie? Because if that's the date the lines had to be drawn and we had an extra district, so we'd have to go back from there.
From there to add it to the charter and.
Yes.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, so that's quick for that date, because.
well, maybe we don't need to know it today, but maybe if you could help us do that count, because, you know, our last thinking was November was kind of the starting point, but if it's March 31st, maybe if somebody could help us count back for like the next meeting, or email us, so kind of the, you know, give us a time. You're muted.
I think the last time it was probably about 5 months or so. If we were going for March, we were thinking we had to get going on adding. If we were going to add to 4-year terms, we would have to start maybe in August.
I don't think I've done the count on March yet, but if we were thinking
if the election was going to be in March, we were going to go to 4-year terms. In order for council to make that in time for that March election, that was about a 5-month going back to start in August. So if you were
start in August, right?
If you're saying you got to go through the same process, we'll get the exact number, but if you have to go through the same process to get that in place by March 31st, as opposed to March 8th, then that's a pretty quick.
Right.
So
What I do think that we were basing those numbers. No, we had to have it into Wake County by November. So maybe 3 or 4 months back rather than 6.
So we have
and then the time to do the maps.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a little more time, but obviously, to the extent we want to make a recommendation on that, the more time we give council to address it, the more likely they will be able to achieve or implement something that we might recommend in this regard.
For that election.
Right.
For that election, but that you don't have that issue with an at-large.
Right. And we do have, and I want to point out, we got several people have dropped off the call too, so we're not going to make a decision today, but you know, I would like us to, you know, think about, we've got a number between 9 and 12, and we've talked about odd probably, but maybe not. So, and I would also just, let me look at this, refer back to the data we have on the spreadsheet. You know, there's very few jurisdictions. Charlotte's the only one that we looked at that they have 11. But none of the other jurisdictions come close to that. No, nobody has over 10. So again, I'm just information. I'm not suggesting that's good or bad.
So you've got 9, which would be either one more at large or one district. 10, which would be one of each, or 2 of one and none of the other. And 11, which would be 3 of one and none of the other, or 2. So those are your options to pick from. I think there's a case to be made for districts. So I'm open to another district seat, but I think you've got maybe a half dozen, maybe a little more options if you go 9 to 11. If you go to 12, I mean, I don't see any value in going from 8 to 12. I think we ought to lean towards having an odd number. That would be my thinking.
And I think,
and frankly, I'm not up for making it unduly large, because I think that makes the governance and the management processes involved in that governance all the more complicated. But I do think there's a case for greater district representation. So I'm in the 9 or 11 category, and I would be 1 at large in 9 and 2 at large on 11. But
I would,
in the for what it's worth category.
I just wanted to clarify, I was looking at the data sheet on Charlotte. There's actually 12 council members in Charlotte. I think the data link, when it gives the number of council members in the spreadsheet, excludes the mayor.
You're right. So I'm sorry, there are 12. You're right, I missed that. And then if you add Fayetteville, if that would be 10. But again, nobody beyond that. And I wouldn't underestimate the idea or the having, or at least not consider the complications that are added the bigger the council is to the management team. That's not to say that we shouldn't add. I think it sounds like we're generally in the mode of adding, but I would be very reluctant to consider 12. I just think that's a big number, and it's just, if you think about, if every council member needs 30 minutes or an hour, a week with the county manager, with the city manager, just throwing that out, it's adding a significant burden, potentially. And that doesn't mean they might add an assistant or, manager or whatever. I'm not saying that, but it's at least potentially a significant additional time issue and complicating factor. Well, we've been here for a little over an hour and a half, so I don't think we need to decide anything today. The pressure is going to be here for us to really kind of make a decision on this or make a recommendation. I suggested to council that we would have our report to them by the end of July, but that's not a mandate. They didn't tell us we had to do that. That gives us essentially 2 more meetings unless we want to meet more frequently. I don't think we need to meet more frequently, but I think we're close to being able to do recommendations on engagement once we hear from staff. Is that generally, we may not have a perfect solution, but I think we've got some concrete recommendations. So, I'd like to think we could pull that together next meeting with some staff support in terms of what's reasonable, what they're doing now, and then hopefully touch on this again and I might even think about, I don't know, doing some polling and hand raising on some different options between 9 and 11 and see where we get, because there's no magic number. There's no, like I said, the research out there is all across the board. I don't think there's no right or wrong answer to this. We just need to, as I said in the beginning, if we think we can advance the ball and make the governing structure better, improve it to some extent, that's where I hope we will all be. And I'm certainly willing to compromise on these issues I think that there's room for improvement. And as long as, at least personally, I feel like we're making things better and not making things worse, I'm willing to kind of make sure we get to something that we all can live with. It may not be perfect. And I know that's the stereotypical compromise, but that's where we need to be. We need to figure out a way to get to a place that we can agree and feel good that we're making things better, but maybe not perfect. So with that, anybody have questions, comments, concerns? Otherwise, we'll see you. Our next meeting is scheduled for, what would that be? July 7th. So we'll see everybody on July 7th. And as always, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Enjoy the 4th of July.
Thanks, Val.
Thanks, everybody.